Good evening, hello and welcome. You're with the news today. Primetime destination news, newsmakers, talking points, news without the noise. The big story and the talking point tonight. The Supreme Court has ruled on compensation for COVID victims. Is it deciding COVID policy for the Modi government? Also, the Covaxin scandal has jolted the Brazilian government. What's the inside story? We'll try and find out. But first, the 9 headlines and 9. In a firm message to the Modi government, the Supreme Court rules every single COVID victim is entitled to ex gratia, overrules the Modi government's claims, asks the Disaster Management Authority to fix compensation amount within 6 weeks. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar meets top EU officials to push for a Covishield Green Pass amidst a travel eligibility row. European Union suggests individual nations can accept the vaccine. Brazil suspends a $324 million contract with Bharat Biotech for Covaxin after accusations of irregularities against President Bolsonaro. This as a US research body terms Covaxin effective on Alpha and Delta variants. There will be no vaccination drive in Mumbai tomorrow as the BMC claims there's a shortage of jabs in the city. All government and municipal vaccine centers to remain shut. This as the Modi government hopes to gather momentum for its drive through the month of July. More drones spotted at 2 defense installations in Jammu today. High-level security meeting held to review the latest terror threat. Punjab Congress leader and former cricketer Navjot Singh Sidhu meets Rahul and Priyanka Gandhi in the national capital. Congress insiders say an announcement on a new role for Sidhu within the next 48 hours. Modi government gives a big warning to top tech giant, says cannot brush aside accountability in the name of free speech. Twitter asked to submit a response on blocking an IT minister's account tomorrow. Google employees listen to customer conversations via Google Assistant. Tech giant admits to a privacy breach in their testimony to a parliamentary IT panel. And Canada records an all-time high temperature, 9.5 degrees Celsius, over 200 dead in a week amidst the scorching heat wave. But our top story tonight comes from the Supreme Court, where the apex court today gave an ultimatum to the Narendra Modi government at the centre. The Supreme Court has given the centre 6 weeks to ensure ex gratia compensation for families of COVID-19 victims. The top court said the ex gratia under the Disaster Management Act is mandatory and not discretionary. The court has left it to the government to decide the amount and the guidelines for the ex gratia. The Modi government so far has said that this is not a natural disaster and therefore there was no need for compensation for COVID victims. Our top story today comes from Anisha Mathur.
Every single victim of COVID-19 is entitled to ex gratia compensation. These are the words of the highest court of India. The court further added that the National Disaster Management Authority has failed to do its duty in not recommending an ex gratia for victims. The Supreme Court has directed the NDMA to decide the minimum financial relief for those families who have lost someone to COVID-19 within 6 weeks. The top court ruled that ex gratia to victims of a national disaster under Section 12 of the Disaster Management Act is mandatory and not discretionary. The Supreme Court also rejected the argument of the centre reading shall as may in Section 12 of the Disaster Management Act. The court has left it to the NDMA to decide the amount to be provided, keeping the funds in mind. It has directed that death certificates of COVID-19 should show the exact reason and date of the death. The facility will be set up for correcting the cause of the death if a family is not satisfied. The ruling was given by a bench comprising Justices Ashok Bhushan and M.R. Shah. They were hearing a petition demanding 4 lakh rupees ex gratia for COVID victims. The central government had filed an affidavit in the court saying ex gratia of 4 lakh is not possible due to financial constraints.
The court also took note of the fact that death certificates do not reflect death by COVID-19 and has asked the authorities to ensure that the rules and the streamlining of the guidelines is done as soon as possible. In addition, the court has also noted that the 15th Finance Commission recommendations for a universal medical insurance scheme for COVID must also be implemented as soon as possible. In New Delhi, this is Anisha Mathur for India Today.
Now, the significance of what the court did today is to really send out a message to the Narendra Modi government and the centre on COVID policy. But importantly, this is not the first such COVID policy intervention. Vaccine procurement, for example, has been centralised after the Supreme Court's criticism. On oxygen, it was the Supreme Court that set up a task force to streamline the distribution. Remember, the Delhi High Court had issued very strong orders again on oxygen. Again, it was the centre which has been acting on issues like setting up a labour database for migrant labour and unorganised labour and asking for financial relief for them. And today the Supreme Court has ordered the National Disaster Management Authority to decide ex gratia for COVID victims. So there are a number of issues where it is the Supreme Court that seems to be driving COVID policy. And that's my big question and my talking point right at the top. Is the Supreme Court driving COVID policy? Should the Modi government give compensation to COVID victims on priority basis? Is this a case of judicial overreach or simply a case of executive failure? These are some of the questions I will raise. Dushyant Dave, senior advocate and former president of the Supreme Court Bar Association, joins me. Anjali Bhardwaj, social activist who took up the case of migrant labour that was heard by the Supreme Court yesterday. TV Mohandas Pai, chairman Areem Capital, has strong views on the issue. And M. Shashidhar Reddy is former vice chairperson of the National Disaster Management Authority. I want to come to you, Mr. Dave, first, because 2 months ago, in the month of April, you, before the Supreme Court, said that you were dismayed and disappointed with the way the Supreme Court was acting on COVID. 2 months later, given the role that the Supreme Court now seems to be playing, would you say it is the Supreme Court that is driving forward COVID policy?
Well, I won't say Supreme Court is driving forward COVID policy. What the Supreme Court is doing was expected of the Supreme Court to have done in the first instance. Well, better late than never. Supreme Court should have really intervened last year because, the basic issue, Rajdeep, is this. Why is it that Supreme Court interfering? And why is it that people perceive that this is an interference by the Supreme Court? Supreme Court is doing its duty. So the judicial review is basic structure of our constitution. And Supreme Court has an absolute, duty as sentinel on que vive. To really, look after the fundamental rights and welfare of the citizens. Now, last year, government has made a very serious mistake. I would say Himalayan blunder in not declaring COVID as a national disaster within the meaning of the National Disaster Management Act. And as a result, there is no coherent policy which is framed for the purpose of dealing with, this pandemic, particularly to deal with, the welfare of the people. Now, as a result, the Supreme Court is required to interfere. Had the Supreme Court interfered last year, Justice Bhushan's bench only, which I had argued on behalf of Prashant Bhushan, where we wanted Supreme Court to direct the government to declare the pandemic as a national disaster, the Supreme Court said no. Had it been done then, we would have been much better off. We would have had a very consistent policy, a good framework, and absolutely, protective, mechanism. But Supreme Court didn't do so.
No, so you don't accept, Mr. Dave, that this is a case of judicial overreach? That at the end of the day, issues like vaccine, issues of compensation, issues of, how do you treat migrant labor are surely to be decided by the executive. Isn't that the job of the executive?
Well, the executive failed miserably. What has the executive been doing since March of 2020? Mr. Prime Minister declared a lockdown on 24th of March 2020. Why? Because he feared that there is a serious pandemic, although there were 400 cases. Now, when you have 400,000 cases a day, government is singularly sleeping over declaring a national lockdown and trying to protect citizens. Lakhs have died. Supreme Court had no option. It has a duty. There is a concept called parens petri, which means the Supreme Court, unlike the state, is today under our constitution the parent of the nation. And as parent of the nation, I think Supreme Court has an absolute duty and an obligation and a pious duty to do what it has done.
Okay. Mohandas Pai, respond to what you're hearing, that the Supreme Court had a pious duty to do what it has done because the executive has failed, whether it's on compensation, where in an affidavit before the court, the executive said they cannot pay because they don't have the monies to pay all COVID victims. Also said this is a natural disaster and therefore does not come within the ambit of ex gratia compensation. Now you have the likes of the Supreme Court and indeed Mr. Dave supporting it, saying it's executive failure that required judicial intervention.
No, Rajdeep, my personal view is this is judicial overreach for a pretty long period of time. Even if the government comes up short of what some people expect, mark my words, people expect means some lawyers in Delhi and they go pursue the court because they happen to be in Delhi. I think the Supreme Court should not interfere too much. Show me one country in the world where the Supreme Court is as activist as it is in India. The Constitution, in my opinion, I mean, Mr. Dave is a greater lawyer than me. I'm just a law graduate. Does not give them the kind of powers they do. They assume the powers. This is judicial overreach. And the judiciary can persuade the government, ask the government to come out, but to order, for example, that oxygen matter, give 750 tons of oxygen. Supreme Court can't do that. On what basis was 750 tons done? Please remember that. And the comments of the Madras High Court, the election commission should be held up for murder. These are all obiter dicta, I understand, but you don't make such comments. I think the three organs of the government of the state have to work in unison. The powers are clearly defined. And the sad thing about the Supreme Court is, if the Supreme Court has judicial overreach, what is the remedy? There is no remedy. Because the Supreme Court is supreme because there's nobody above it. And Supreme Court, they do whatever they want. Under Article 19, right to life, they can dictate and say everything is right to life. Everything is right to life in this country. It can be done. I think it's total judicial overreach. I think respect for the government should be there.
No, respect is one thing, but what if the government is unable to provide citizens oxygen, or is refusing to provide compensation, or has a confused vaccine policy based on price discrimination? Is the court to say we are not going to intervene?
Rajdeep, can the court take over the government or run the government? Can the court say I'll dismiss the government and run the government? Is the court competent to do that? Now let us look at oxygen. There's a shortage of oxygen, Rajdeep. There is no production of oxygen. Government did everything. It's an allocation of oxygen. Now you got this report, auction audit report, saying that the AAP government lied on record.
That's an interim report. That's an interim report. That's an interim report. But
interim or final report is based on data. The Supreme Court cannot step into the truth of government, can persuade the government. Tell me one country in the world where the Supreme Court of a country will do that. In the United States, have you heard of anything like that? In the UK, have you heard of anything like that? They're all the same kind of democracies.
Let Mr. Dave respond, and then I'll go to the other panelists, because this is interesting. You've got two varying viewpoints. Mr. Mohandas Pai saying clear judicial overreach. Mr. Dave suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Dave, that it is the duty of the Supreme Court to do this. Mr. Mohandas Pai is saying this doesn't happen in any other democracy.
Let me answer that to Mr. Pai, and I have great regard and respect for him, but he perhaps has forgotten that just last year, the United Kingdom Supreme Court directed the Prime Minister to convene the session of the Parliament. Now, was that an overreach? It certainly is not an overreach.
That is the law. That's the law to settle a problem. That is not
just a second. I didn't interrupt you.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry.
I expect the same respect from you.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry.
When 2G and Colgate cases were being decided and Supreme Court ordered investigations by CBI, the Bharatiya Janata Party was shouting from top of the houses, saying Supreme Court has done wonders. I mean, this hypocrisy of political parties must end. Forget, these parties. These citizens have an absolute right to knock the doors of the Supreme Court. If the citizens can't do it, the public-spirited citizens, yes, we are the lawyers sitting in Delhi, Mr. Pai, and we are proud to do what we are doing. We are proud. You may perhaps have a very poor opinion of us, but there are millions of the people of the country, tens of millions, who bless us for what we do. So please don't forget that in a democracy, every voice matters and everybody has a duty to, do. We have done our duty to help people who can't help themselves. We are a nation where almost 80 to 90 crore people can't approach the court to remedy their legal rights. Their legal
Rajdeep,
rights,
yes.
basically, just a sec.
Yeah, very
Mr.
quickly.
Bhai, please.
Yeah, very quickly.
Just a sec. If there was a disaster plan last year made, it would have provided for production of oxygen and distribution of oxygen as well. This is all right. Because of the ad hocism of the government, these problems have arisen.
Okay.
And that's the basic problem.
Rajdeep.
Government shied away from this plan because government didn't want to give the relief to people. This government is a government which lacks in empathy. It has no feelings for people. It's all right for Prime Minister to come on television and shed a tear or two. But that's not his policies. His actions don't support that. His action shows that he doesn't care a damn for people.
Rajdeep,
Okay, strong words
Rajdeep,
that the Prime Minister
Rajdeep,
doesn't care a damn,
Rajdeep.
but Mohandas Pai respond, because those are very strong words
Rajdeep,
being used.
Rajdeep, I am fully with Mr. Dave. He has every right to go to court, take up citizens' matters. He can right to do everything. We have seen the court open up at midnight to look at the death sentence of a criminal who's been sentenced to death. It doesn't happen to everybody. I'm in Bangalore. If something happens in Bangalore, who will go to Supreme Court for me? Nobody. Some people are privileged. The court is going out of the way for some people, right? We see that happening all over the time. Now, Mr. Dave is right. He has full rights to represent anybody. He has full right to get upset. He is a lawyer. I respect him a lot. That is his duty. You cannot talk about Mr. Dave. But the court has to exercise restraint. The court cannot step into the shoes of the government. Whatever be the cost,
Right.
the court can push the government, but to step in to take over executive. Tomorrow, let them run the country. Today, respect for government. When the government fails, the court has to persuade the government. There is a clear demarcation of powers. You should
Right.
not overstep. Tomorrow, if the political leaders or somebody criticize the court and say the court is overstepping and take them on publicly, respect for the court will come down. We can't afford that in a democracy.
So you believe that the powers of the court are limited to the court at best guiding the government but not dictating terms to the
Judicial
government?
restraint. They have to
Judicial
exercise
restraint. You
judicial
use that word.
restraint.
I take your point. Let me
Judicial restraint.
let me go to Anjali Bhardwaj for a moment, because Anjali Bhardwaj has actually been a petitioner in one of the COVID cases that involved migrant labor. The Supreme Court, remember yesterday, asked the government to frame to ensure that databases were provided of organized labor, community kitchens were put in place. Now, there will be those Anjali Bhardwaj who will say, look, the government also has its limits of what it can and cannot do. For example, the database for unorganized labor, according to the government, is not easy to put together. So activists can push the government, courts can push the government, but ultimately the framework has to be decided by governments, not by activists or not by the courts. How do you respond?
Rajdeep, I don't think it's anybody's case that framework should not be decided by governments. But let us get one thing very clear, that what we are seeing in the country right now is a clear abdication of responsibility on the part of governments. We know that we are in the middle of a pandemic. We, at the same time, are seeing that governments are in total denial. There is a constant refrain, whether it is in court or outside, where we hear people say, including the Prime Minister, that there is no national lockdown this time in the second wave, and therefore we are hearing government after government saying that things are not so bad. And yet, if you just step out, you can see the kind of misery and destitute millions of people are in our country are in. Let us remember, Rajdeep, that 90% of our workforce is in the unorganized sector. What happens to them when there is a lockdown that is imposed? Is that not known to the government? And we already
when the government, for example, brings, sorry to intervene, Anjali Bhardwaj, when the Modi government, for example, says one nation, one ration card and intends to bring it, intends to enforce it, do you give the government the benefit of the doubt or not?
One nation, one ration card can have ration cards, Rajdeep. And the reality is that last time during the lockdown, it became very clear that people lose their sources of income and then they have really nothing to fall back on to feed themselves and their children. The government needed to put in place systems for a basic social security and food security net to make sure that people can live a life of dignity. And now coming to the Supreme
government says it's
Court's
done that.
judgments.
Anjali Bardwaj, the
No,
government
so
claims it has
Rajdeep,
done it.
let me say this, that the Supreme Court, if you just look at the judgment that the court has passed, is really putting on record the fact that there is a violation of our constitutional rights. The Supreme Court is not coming in just to dictate policy or to give directions to a government and stepping into the executive shoes. It's saying what is happening. It's saying there's a violation of Article 21, the right to live with dignity. We know of lakhs of people who have been
Rajdeep.
reduced to begging for
Right. Okay. You're
middle
saying
of the lockdowns and the pandemic, and they have no way to feed themselves. So the court is simply upholding people's constitutional and statutory rights.
Okay.
And I think that that is the responsibility in a democratic republic of the courts, of the judiciary. I don't think that there is a question of overreach. The governments have had enough time.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we haven't seen policies come, and people can't be left to either beg or starve. Look at the case. UP, she and her 5 children were starving for days, and they're still in hospital probably right now. So we can't have a situation where the courts keep silent when people's rights are being trampled upon.
Okay.
And that's really what is happening right now. If you looked at the vaccine case as well, what did the court do which was judicial overreach? The court just asked straight, simple questions. The court said, why has it been left to the states to ask to buy vaccines? The court just said, give us the policy that you're adopting. What else did the court say? Similarly, in the migrant workers case yesterday, one of the pleas was to say, give some cash transfers to people. They have no way to feed their children, even milk. Otherwise, they don't have any way to get medicines. But the court said that that's a policy matter for the executive.
okay.
They did not give any direction. So I think the
you
court is
made
being
your
very
point.
balanced, but it is coming in to do its duty.
Okay, you made your point, and very strongly and passionately at that. Before I go back to Mr. Dave and Mr. Pai, I think Shashidhar Reddy, former Vice Chairman of NDMA, is with us, because remember, it's the National Disaster Management Authority that has been asked now to implement the guidelines for compensation. Do you believe that this qualifies, COVID qualifies, Mr. Reddy, for compensation? And how are the guidelines going to be framed? How much do you give? Some people are saying 4 lakhs, others are saying 10 lakhs. This in a country where many people who may have died of COVID don't even have death certificates saying they've died of COVID. How is this going to actually happen? The actual implementation, Mr. Reddy?
Well, even those people who have died with comorbidities are not, the death certificate doesn't show that it was because of COVID. So that's a different issue. Yes, compensation. This is an extraordinary situation. We cannot say that this is not one of those disasters that keeps recurring. But you know, it's something that has devastated the entire economy, and the poorest of the poor have suffered. Compensation needs to be paid. The quantum of compensation is something that the Supreme Court has asked the NDMA to frame. NDMA has the National Executive Committee headed by the Home Secretary to assist NDMA in doing its work.
So do you believe that the NDMA, do you believe that the government was wrong in the first instance, Mr. Reddy, to say that this is not a natural disaster and therefore does not qualify under Section 12 for compensation to be paid?
Well, I don't agree with that. This is, people are dying. This is, we've looked at pandemics in the past, H1N1. We framed guidelines for H1N1 in the past.
Did you pay compensation?
I don't think it's right for the government to say that, it doesn't.
Did you pay compensation for H1N1 victims?
No, I mean, it was widespread. 34 countries, about 6,000 people died in all these, throughout the world. It was not, this scale was very low. So you're saying this is an extraordinary situation.
So you're saying this is an extraordinary situation that deserves extraordinary measures. Let me just for a moment go back to Mr. Pai, because the word that both Mr. Dave used and to some extent Anjali certainly used, empathy, and now Mr. Reddy is saying extraordinary situation. Two E's, extraordinary and more empathy. You see, governments need to show empathy, Mr. Pai. If they don't, then the courts will intervene.
Rajdeep, I totally agree with you. Government has to show empathy. I totally support the case for compensation for all those who have died. Compensation has to be paid. India has enough money. For 4 lakh people, if you pay 4 lakh people, if you pay 4 lakh, 16,000 crores. Government of India spent 35 lakh crores. They must pay. I don't know why the government put that silly note before the Supreme Court to say fiscal matters. These are not fiscal matters. 16,000 crores is not going to hurt. That is not the point. I agree with Anjali, I agree with Mr. Dave. We need more empathy. We need better things. The only question I'm asking is it the Supreme Court who has to do it or the government? If the government doesn't do it, the political parties and others have to put pressure on the government. The political system has to work.
Let's be fair. Mr. Pai, let's be fair to Rahul. Let's be fair to Rahul Gandhi, for example. He has been banging on about compensation to be given. Other opposition parties are also saying give compensation to COVID victims. Now you can't then say, but the government itself, before in its affidavit, says we don't have the resources. What then does the court do?
No. The court should tell the government to re-examine, but the court cannot order. Rajdeep, will the court run the country? I agree with Anjali. People beg in this country. People die for want of medicine. It's happened for 70 years. What do we do? Can we then shut down the government and say Supreme Court will appoint Mr. Dave as somebody to run the country and Anjali will go before, give petitions and the court will decide and they will run it? Is that the way to run the country?
Okay.
We have to improve the government.
This
I
is
agree with you. There is failure of government.
This is
but
the
court
third or
cannot
fourth time.
overstep its jurisdiction.
Okay. Third or fourth time you said the courts cannot run the country. Mr. Dave, you want to respond? The sense that is being given by critics of the court's interventions is that the court cannot run the country. It can, as some have suggested, offer suggestions to the government, but in the end, the executive, whether in Delhi or indeed state capitals, has to implement vaccines, has to implement oxygen supplies, has to implement compensation.
I think there is a very serious misconception of law here, constitutional law. Constitution expressly says that the Supreme Court, if there is violations of fundamental rights, which Mr. Pai also accepts, has a duty to issue mandamus, certiorari, and all other writs which are required to be issued for ensuring compliance of fundamental rights, compliance of statutory duties, and ensuring protection of legal rights. Now, if National Disaster Management Act required a national disaster plan to be prepared, and if it is not prepared, then whatever the consequence arise, it's a statutory mechanism. It's a law created by Parliament. Government of the day can't just get out of that act. Under that act, therefore, you have to mitigate the suffering of the people. That's what that law is about. And you have to therefore provide ex gratia payment for the loss of jobs and other things. That's expressly provided in section 11 and 12. Now, I'll tell you something hypocritical about the government. Just after COVID hit the country last year, the nation was also hit by locust, menace in Rajasthan and other states. The government declared that as a national disaster. Now, if you are going to declare a locust attack as a national disaster and provide relief under the National Disaster Relief Fund, why not do this under this? Okay. I can't just understand the government. That is why I genuinely believe that government is not advised. Unfortunately, the Attorney General of India, with greatest respect to him, because I have great regard and affection for Mr. Venugopal, does not seem to have guided the government properly on this aspect. Okay. I can understand bureaucrats are not able to stand up to the Prime Minister. But the Attorney General must step in and tell the government that this is the law. You have to implement the law. On the contrary, the Solicitor General appeared in the Supreme Court and said, there is no such crisis. We don't need a plan. There was a plan which was prepared in 2019. Now that plan doesn't even use the word COVID. So, and look at the most important proof of the pudding is in eating. It was only because of intervention by Supreme Court from time to time that government changed its vaccine policy and has decided, after many of us, including me, begged for a free vaccination to the people of the country. Government had to change. Now, if government does not want to change, then certainly government has to remind it by orders of the Supreme Court.
Okay, so you're saying
that's happening.
Okay, so you're saying the Supreme Court is not running the country, but reminding the government of its duties to the people of the country. Anjali Bharadwaj, the government in its affidavit through the Solicitor General also said on the compensation case that, look, it's not just compensation. We are providing other benefits to people. We are trying to mitigate their loss. don't only look at compensation or ex gratia payment. That's, to use their words, a rather pedantic way of looking at this issue. Your response? Ms. Bhardwaj, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry. Yes, Rajdeep, now I can hear you.
Yeah.
Rajdeep,
Yes. Go ahead.
sorry, can you just...
Go ahead.
Well, first address some of the things that have been said also. The government has been, we all saw, the entire country saw, there's no way the government didn't see, the way migrant workers took to the road last year when there was a lockdown that was imposed. We all know that in the last 1 year itself, we've had a huge number of people. Studies are showing 230 million people in our country have actually slipped into poverty in the last 1 year. So the empathy is one thing where, despite knowing what the problems were and what needed to be done to address those problems, basically ensure food, ensure that people have money to pay their rents and they are not rendered homeless, all of that, no learning was taken from last year. And this year we saw governments going straight into lockdowns and into the second wave of the pandemic, which could have easily been predicted as well that was coming, and not putting in place any system.
Okay. So
take it a step further. It's not just about empathy.
Yes.
Let me just finish. It's
Yes.
not about empathy alone. It is, finally, we are a democracy. It's about rights. As a citizen of this country, do I have the right to live with dignity or not? Do I have to be forced to beg to feed my children? Do I have to be forced to go into the black market and buy oxygen cylinders? Is that not an absolute...
Ma'am, I don't think there is any argument that people have suffered. The question is,
we are in the middle of a pandemic.
The question, right?
Yes.
No, I take your point about rights of citizens which need to be protected by the courts. The question is, inevitably that will reach to what some will call some kind of judiciary versus government tension. But yes, Mohandas Pai, let me give you a final word.
Rajdeep,
Since you seem to be isolated.
Rajdeep, I have a right to life, I have a right to justice under the Constitution, and the Supreme Court has to give me justice. I don't get justice in my country. Cases take 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. People are on death row for long periods of time. Under trials are there in court, in jail, for more than what they'll get sentenced. Who is supposed to remedy that? Is it not the Supreme Court? Should not the Supreme Court focus on what it needs to be done?
No, but surely in the last 12 months, Mr. Pai, the priority of this country is COVID. And if on specific issues the government fails, the courts have to intervene.
Rajdeep, if you go and say that the focus is COVID, let me also ask you, Rajdeep, COVID second wave did not happen all over the country at the same time. It happened in Maharashtra first. Maharashtra had a local shutdown. There was no national shutdown because it didn't happen at the same time all over the country. Then it happened in Gujarat. Then it happened in Delhi. The Delhi government did not do a good job. Karnataka government did a good job, right? Look, it is first event was a national. I don't want to argue with them. I sympathize with them. I want everybody to get relief. I want everybody to be happy. I want everybody to have food, money in the bank and everything. But there are limitations. What do we do? Will the Supreme Court tomorrow say, I want to raise 40 lakh crores and give everybody monthly income? Can the Supreme Court do it? There has to be judicial restraint.
Okay, you keep using the word judicial restraint. Mr. Dave and Anjali Bhardwaj use rights and duties as priorities, rights of the citizen, duties in a way of the court. Mr. Shashidhar Reddy, you've spoken less, so I'll give you a final 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that we need to understand is when the administration fails, the judiciary has to intervene. There is no doubt about it, no question of any doubt. The rights of the people have to be protected. I recall an international law conference held in 1994. The then Prime Minister, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, while addressing it in the presence of the then Chief Justice, Mr. Ahmadi, said that if the administration fails, the judiciary must interfere, must intervene.
Okay.
And then the plight of the people, the kind of hardship they've been put to, don't go into technicalities.
Okay.
People have to come. And then
I think that's a salutary.
That I would like to mention here.
Yes.
Mr. Rahul Gandhi has been demanding right from the beginning, give money, put money in the hands of the poorest of the poor.
I have today stayed away from politics. I have today stayed away from politics because then it would have become a tutu meme. I wanted to focus on rights and duties of citizens. I did mention Rahul Gandhi did raise the issue, and credit to him for that. No one denies him the credit. You are from the Congress, Mr. Reddy, before you became NDMA chairman. So you will, of course, praise Rahul Gandhi. But yes, Mr. Dave, 30 seconds also to you.
Rajdeep, throughout the Constituent Assembly debates, when they debated on creation of Supreme Court and High Courts and the right of the Supreme Court and High Court to protect the fundamental rights, and when they created fundamental rights, Sardar Patel was in fact the chairman of the Fundamental Rights Committee. They very, very strongly all talked and argued about it, that we are creating these rights for the citizens because we know that tomorrow the executive will be failing. And when the executive fails, the judiciary will step in to protect them. I respectfully urge my good friend, Mr. Mohandas Pai, to read those Constituent Assembly debates to find out what the framers of the Constitution wanted the Supreme Court to be. That's the Supreme Court today. We should be proud of. The Supreme Court has enhanced its respectability amongst the masses, not lowered it. Mr. Pai is wrong.
This is, of course, the same. This is, of course, may I just also point out, this is the same Supreme Court which a year ago did not seem to recognize the fact that migrants were walking along the streets of the country. So 1 year is a long time for the Supreme Court to have traversed from saying migrants are not walking on the roads of the country to today demanding that compensation be given to COVID victims and also ensuring that migrant labor get their due. Let's leave it there. Fascinating to hear 4 clear voices on this issue. Appreciate your joining me on my top talking point this evening. Let me turn to the other story, which is coming from Brazil but has an India connection. Brazil has just suspended a multi-million-dollar contract for Covaxin vaccines from India. The decision comes after allegations of corruption in the deal struck between the Bolsonaro government and Bharat Biotech. Bharat Biotech has denied the allegations. Let's take a look at this report.
Brazil has suspended its $324 million contract for Covaxin after accusations of irregularities against President Jair Bolsonaro in the deal. The decision to suspend the vaccine deal was taken by the government after an advice by the Comptroller General of the Union. The deal to buy 20 million doses from Bharat Biotech got mired in controversy after whistleblowers spoke out alleging possible corruption. The Bolsonaro government is accused of buying the vaccine at $15 per dose, while the Pfizer vaccine was being offered at $10. It is being alleged that Bharat Biotech has sent an invoice for an advanced payment of $45 million through Singapore-based company Madison Biotech. This invoice is allegedly in violation of the contract. The Senate Commission investigating the charges will also probe whether Bharat Biotech representative Precisa Medicamentos received $100 million for facilitating the contract. The investigation started after a former head of the Health Ministry's Import Division, Ricardo Miranda, claimed there was pressure on him to clear the Covaxin deal. President Bolsonaro has rejected the charges.
This matter was discussed and under the guidance of the Office of the Comptroller General of the Union, for convenience and opportunity, we decided to suspend the contract so that more in-depth analysis can be carried out, more investigations are carried out. On the other hand, the Ministry of Health will conduct an administrative investigation.
Bharat Biotech says it has received all regulatory approvals in finalizing the vaccine deal with the Brazilian government. It says Covaxin is priced between $15 and $20 for the international market. The Hyderabad-based company also denied getting any advance payment from Brazil. The allegations of corruption in the vaccine deal has added to Bolsonaro's troubles. The Brazilian president is already facing public anger over mishandling the COVID pandemic. 500,000 people have died in the country due to coronavirus.
Many cities across Brazil held protests against the government on Saturday, 19th of June. As of 24th of June, Brazil has registered 500,000 deaths. Now, political observers see this current situation here as a big threat to the current government. The alleged corruption scandal could even lead to its downfall. From Sao Paulo, Brazil, this is Yash Bhavaskar for India Today.
Let me go across to Fabio Zanini, editor-at-large at Folha de Sao Paulo, live from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Appreciate your joining us, Paulo. Give us a sense, is this Brazil's internal politics at work, the Senate there trying to, in a way, encircle your President Bolsonaro? Or is there substance to believe that there was a middleman involved in the deal who could have made a lot of money? Because Bharat Biotech in India is saying that they did not provide the vaccine, nor were they given any payments. What's the real story, Fabio?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Well, we still don't know exactly the full picture here. It is a big corruption scandal. As you mentioned, Bolsonaro is under threat because he has been accused of mismanagement of the pandemic. But now there's this new charge of corruption because Bolsonaro made his name as a politician here in Brazil, as a clean politician, saying that there was no corruption in Brazilian government during his more than 2 years in office. And now there's this very serious allegation that the contract with the Indian company could involve the payment of bribes and of more of prices that were excessive and thus very detrimental to the Brazilian treasury. We don't know yet if these allegations will put political pressure on him. There is a talk here of an impeachment process against Bolsonaro. There will be demonstrations on Saturday here in Sao Paulo and in other cities of Brazil, trying to force the start of an impeachment process against Bolsonaro. But there's also the possibility that there's a case of a middleman, as you said, because trying to make some easy money.
There is talk of a representative coming to New Delhi and the agreement being signed a couple of days later. There's also talk of a Singapore-based company called Madison Biotech. Now, we don't know what Madison Biotech, Bharat Biotech has said Madison Biotech is its global sales and marketing arm. We don't know, therefore, who exactly was actually executing or signing the deal. So, is there any sense that there could be a middleman, a Brazilian middleman involved in this?
Yes, there's a possibility. There's a strong possibility that there could be a middleman involved in this transaction. As I said, this information was released last week.
Right.
So there's a commission investigating the matter in the Senate. Brazil has been paralyzed politically by this issue. We've been following these investigations in the Senate day after day, and we still don't have the clear picture. We still don't have all the information about the real extent of the corruption. What we know is that this is putting immense pressure on a government and on a president that's been facing calls for impeachment and big unpopularity. Very
interesting, Fabio. We'll keep track of this story here in India, and you keep track of it for us in Sao Paulo. Wonderful to have you there telling us what's happening in Brazil. Thanks very much. This could be...
Thank you very much.
This could be a major story now blowing up there in Brazil with an India Connect. Let's turn to tonight's Get Real India story, where shocking cases of dowry deaths coming from states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, both states with very high literacy rates and strong female empowerment, have raised questions. Why is it that crimes like dowry deaths continue in states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu? What does it say about social structures in some of these states even today? Take a look at today's Get Real India story, because 3 promising lives have been lost in the last 2 weeks alone. Here's our report.
Vismaya, 24 years old. Jyotishri, 23 years old. Suchitra, 19 years old. Three young women whose untimely deaths are being blamed on dowry harassment. In 10 days, in India's two big southern states, 3 promising young lives lost. The first in this disturbing series of cases was on June the 21st, when Vismaya was found hanging inside the bathroom of her home in Kollam, Kerala. Days before her death, Vismaya, an Ayurvedic student, had told one of her relatives that she was being subjected to brutal violence. WhatsApp chats between the two, now accessed by the Kerala police, reveal that her husband would thrash her usually after coming home, would kick her in the face, and when she fell down, he used to press his leg into her face. Vismaya also said in her chats that her husband hurled abuse at her and her father, saying that the vehicle he received in dowry was no good.
അത് മരണമല്ല, അതൊരു കൊലപാതകം തന്നെയാണ്. കാരണമെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ നിരന്തരം സ്ത്രീധനപീഡനം അനുഭവിച്ചുകൊണ്ടാണ് എൻ്റെ കുട്ടിക്ക് വന്ന പോലെ ഇപ്പം ഒരുപാട് ഈ കഥകൾ കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇനി ഒരാൾക്കും അവസ്ഥ വരരുത്.
A day later, 19-year-old Suchitra was found dead at her home in Kerala on June the 22nd. The police is probing the possibility of dowry harassment causing her death. Suchitra had gotten married to Vishnu, an army officer, on the 19th of March. Her family alleges that the family of her husband had been harassing her for 10 lakh rupees in dowry.
ഞങ്ങളുടെ മോൾ ഒരു കാരണവശാലും ആത്മഹത്യ ചെയ്യേണ്ട ഒരു കാര്യമില്ല. ഞങ്ങളുടെ മോളുടെ കൈയൊന്ന് മുറിഞ്ഞാൽ അവൾക്ക് അത്രയ്ക്ക് ദണ്ണം മരുന്ന് അവൾ ഒരു ആത്മഹത്യക്ക് ശ്രമിക്കുമെന്ന് ഞങ്ങൾക്കാർക്കും വിശ്വാസമില്ല. ഞങ്ങൾ വിശ്വസിക്കത്തുമില്ല. അവളെ കൊന്നതാണ്. ഞങ്ങളുടെ മോൾക്ക് നീതി കിട്ടണം.
നമ്മൾ കേസിൻ്റെ അന്വേഷണം ആരംഭിച്ചിട്ടേ ഉള്ളൂ. എല്ലാ ആസ്പെക്റ്റും പരിശോധിക്കും. കേസെടുത്ത് എക്സിക്യൂട്ടീവ് മജിസ്ട്രേറ്റിൻ്റെ നേതൃത്വത്തിൽ ഇൻക്വസ്റ്റ് നടപടിക്രമങ്ങൾ നടന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്.
നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിൽ ഈ രീതിയിലുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാകുന്നത് വളരെ ഖേദകരമായ ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്. തുടർന്ന് ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാകാതിരിക്കാൻ ജാഗ്രത പാലിക്കേണ്ടത് എല്ലാ മാതാപിതാക്കളുടെയും ആവശ്യമാണ്.
The latest death to come to light is that of 23-year-old Jyotishri in Chennai. Found dead at her home in April, the police have now recovered notes blaming her in-laws for harassment over dowry. And most crucially, deleted videos from her phone accusing her in-laws of harassment. Jyotishri had married Balamurugan in December last year. Her family had given a large sum of money and jewelry to the groom at the time of the wedding, but Balamurugan's family allegedly sought more money. Unable to bear the pain inflicted upon her by her husband and in-laws, Jyotishri returned to her father's home within weeks of the wedding. The family managed to settle the issue temporarily. However, as soon as Jyotishri returned to her in-laws' home in Chennai, her mother-in-law allegedly locked her up in a room and cut off the power supply. Unable to bear the torture, Jyotishri is said to have taken the extreme step. While police investigations are on in all 3 cases, with arrests made in 2, the frightening spate of dowry deaths has come as a searing reminder that unlike these 3 young victims, one of India's oldest social evils is alive and well. With Gopikrishnan Unithan in Thiruvananthapuram and Pramod Madhav in Chennai, Bureau Report, India Today.
A troubling story there coming from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. To our good news story, and this is a fascinating story. Mangoes that cost 10,000 rupees each. That's right. We're talking about a mango deal that was closed by an 11-year-old in Jharkhand. What happened? Find out in our good news today story.
Meet Tulsi Kumari, an 11-year-old mango vendor from Jharkhand's Jamshedpur. She has just closed one of the costliest mango deals ever, selling 12 mangoes for 10,000 rupees each. The miracle, courtesy a Mumbai-based businessman who came to know about Tulsi's dream of buying a smartphone to attend online classes. Not only did Ameya Hete pay 1,20,000 rupees for the mangoes, he bought her a phone as well.
हमको मोबाइल चाहिए था, मेरे लिए मोबाइल भी नहीं था पढ़ने के लिए, उसी लिए आम बेच रहे थे। पढ़ने का भी दिक्कत था और घर में राशन नहीं था, हम लोग भूखे रह जाते थे, कभी आम बिक्री नहीं होता था तो उससे आम बिक्री करते थे तो हम लोग चावल उबला के खाते थे।
To Tulsi's mother, the gesture is beyond belief.
जो उसको पढ़ाई का जरूरी था वो पढ़ने के लिए, बच्चा तो पढ़ेंगे लिखेंगे, जिद्दी में वो निकल गया वो कि नहीं हम जा रहे आम बेचने बोल के। फिर उसी में वो दिया, बम्बई से उसको मोबाइल खरीद दिया, पैसा दिया, उसका अकाउंट में भेज दिया कि बच्चा और आगे कुछ बन के दिखाओ, पढ़ो लिखो, अच्छा से रहो बोल के वो लोग खुश हुआ, वो लोग का जितना हम लोग को अच्छा लगा।
Hete says he got to know about Tulsi through a social media post.
तुलसी की एक बात बहुत अच्छी लगी हमें, जो उसकी जो जिद थी पढ़ने की, जिसकी वजह से वो खुद कुछ करके पूंजी जमा कर रही थी, ये बात हमें बहुत अच्छी लगी। इसलिए हमने डिसाइड किया कि हम उसकी हर आम 10,000 रुपए की पूंजी में हम लोग खरीदेंगे।
The COVID pandemic has exposed India's big digital divide. A study by NGO Pratham has revealed only 1/3 of India's students are pursuing online education. India needs many Ameyas to help students who have fallen off the education map. Bureau Report, India Today.
That smile makes my day. Wonderful, wonderful story. The magic of the Aam Aadmi and the mango. Okay, let's leave you with our image of the day. Tennis legend Roger Federer is back at Wimbledon, struggling on the court but hasn't lost his sense of humor off it. After a difficult first round game, Federer's inability to understand a common British idiom, absence makes the heart grow fonder, made everyone burst out laughing. We leave you with what happened at the centre court yesterday. Stay well, stay safe, good night, Shubhratri.
I don't understand that saying. My English is not good enough.
Fair enough. So basically, having missed out last year, having been away from this place for 2 years, how special is it to be back here on centre court?
Yes, there you go. A good reminder, my English is not very good.